Mrs. Wilkinson's Chooks by Leonie Puguero and Mike Spohr. Mrs. Wilkinson's Chooks. Mrs. Wilkinson's Chooks by Leonie Puguero and Mike Spohr. When dear Mrs. Wilkinson decides to keep some chooks for company, she gets the company all right, but so does everyone else, and life in the neighbourhood will never be the same again. After her large breed of children had left home, and her dear husband, Mr. Wilkinson, had departed this world, Mrs. Wilkinson decided to keep some chooks for the cheerful company they made, and for the lovely white and brown eggs she could collect in her old straw hat. Violet was the smallest and a great little flyer. "Oh, there you are, Vi. Now be a good girl and don't eat too many of that nice Mr. Blackwell's seedlings." Shirley was the steadiest of this flighty bunch. She was always a most reliable layer. "What a good girl!" cried Mrs. Wilkinson as she collected the fresh, warm eggs. "Isn't our Shirley a dear?" she inquired of the others. It was Maureen, however, who always made a great commotion about the newly hatched eggs, as if they were her own. Naturally, all of this clucking, scratching and flapping found its way into Mr. and Mrs. Longhope's once peaceful garden. "Good morning," Mrs. Wilkinson would call out cheerfully. But they never answered back. "I expect they can't hear anything I say with you girls clucking away," concluded Mrs. Wilkinson thoughtfully. Charlotte was the largest and bossiest of Mrs. Wilkinson's chooks. "You're the head girl, aren't you?" Mrs. Wilkinson would say with a smile. Certainly Charlotte dealt quickly and savagely with any nonsense. Miss Benson's cat Jenkins was one who found that out smartly. "That's right, dear," smiled Mrs. Wilkinson. "You play with the sweet little pussy." Mrs. Wilkinson was happy with her little brood. But what of her neighbours? How did they feel about this hen-filled heaven? The neighbourhood certainly did suffer. Mrs. Wilkinson was a dear, and no one wanted to be unkind, but those chooks were just too much to bear. From his side of the fence, Mr. Blackwell could only labour on. Miss Benson's cat Jenkins left home under the stress. Long hopes, pushed to the limits of endurance, brought a large and powerful beast. His task was to make sure the feathery flock stayed on their own patch. For a time, he was the hope of the neighbourhood. Unfortunately, things didn't quite work out his way. What could be done? "That's right, girls," encouraged Mrs. Wilkinson. "You make young Hercules feel welcome." Once in a while, Mrs. Wilkinson's brother, Henry, left his farm in the care of his kindly next-door neighbour and visited her for the day. Their chatter reminded her of how much she had loved the little family farm where she had grown up with Henry. He was always talking of her return. "Still," she said with a sigh as she tidied up after Henry had left, "at least I have my girls." They were such a comfort to her. But Mrs. Wilkinson found herself often thinking of all the other animals they could play with on the farm, and how much more space there would be for them to flap about in. "Yes, I will accept Henry's offer to move back home," she thought to herself. Once the decision was made, Mrs. Wilkinson flew into action, getting everything ready for departure day. Then, as the last crate was closed, Mrs. Wilkinson said, a little sadly, "Things just won't be the same, will they, girls?" No doubt each of Mrs. Wilkinson's neighbours would have told a different story.